Well, good morning. For several weeks now, Jesus has been giving us some hard teachings. He certainly doesn't mince his words, does he? Perhaps maybe before we attempt to grasp what Jesus is telling us in today's gospel passage from Luke, we should consider the opening words of our first reading from the book of Wisdom. For what man can discern and learn the counsel of God, or who can discern what the Lord wills? For the reasoning of mortals is worthless, and our designs are likely to fail. In effect, we're told that without God's help, without his revelation, we cannot understand his will for us, his plan for our salvation. We must then set aside our own human judgments, our own worldly concerns, and listen to what God is telling us. I think too often we filter the words of Jesus through the lens of our humanity, forgetting that God's ways are very different from the ways of the world. Of course, this is nothing new. Remember how our Lord rebuked Peter when the apostle tried to lead him away from the cross? How did Jesus respond? "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not on the side of God, but of men." Believe me, Peter and you and I, we can get so caught up in our world, a world that colors so much of our thinking. It's hard to avoid it, especially today. So pervasive, so intrusive is the world in our lives. Now, the great crowds surrounding Jesus might not have had the internet, but they were plagued by their own worldly concerns. Interestingly, the fact that Jesus drew such crowds really bothered some folks, especially the self-important folks. That too hasn't changed much. I remember Pope St. John Paul II, he visited 129 countries during his papacy and drew huge crowds everywhere. And I remember once hearing some grumpy bishop say, "This pope probably travels too much. It might be better if he stayed in Rome and paid more attention to the church." John Paul, of course, knew that the church isn't a collection of Vatican buildings and those who occupy them. No, the church is far more expansive. It fills the earth because Jesus called us to make disciples of all nations. Like Jesus, John Paul traveled on his road, calling us all to discipleship. But I wonder what that Galilean crowd thought when they heard these words from Jesus. "If anyone comes to me without hating his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Maybe a more important question is, what do you and I think when we hear those words? Most people are troubled by the use of the word hate, which seems to violate the very heart of Christian teaching. But we shouldn't get too bothered by the effects of translations. It's actually more accurate to understand hate in this sense as meaning to love less. This becomes clear, I think, when we read Matthew's account of the same event where Jesus says, "Whoever loves father and mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." Here we seem to find words we can accept, don't we? But in truth, we really don't accept them, do we? Or perhaps I should say, how you and I live our lives doesn't always reflect an acceptance of Jesus' teaching. Jesus is actually telling these budding disciples of his what their discipleship is all about. He just called the 12 apostles at this point, and they were on the road making their way through the towns and villages of Galilee. But as Luke tells us, they were joined by great crowds who followed Jesus. And to all of these, Jesus revealed something of God's will, of the divine intention. And he did so through a pair of brief parables. On the surface, the parables seem to address the construction of farm buildings or the tactics of waging war. But like every parable, the meaning is far deeper. Jesus was really describing the cost of discipleship, that if we hope to follow him, we better first calculate the cost. Are you willing, he asked his disciples, to accept the cost of placing God first in your lives? This wasn't new to believing Jews, since it was proclaimed in the Shema, the very foundation of Jewish faith, introduced by Moses with these words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord of God, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength." The problem is, you and I and that crowd of Galileans were so wrapped up in the realities of this world, so close to them, that it's easy for us sinners to put these created realities first, to put them ahead of God. No, the Shema tells us, God, the creator of all good, must come first. And now, speaking to the crowds, Jesus applies this revealed truth to himself, that to be God's disciple is to be his disciple. Once more, he reveals his divinity, providing more ammunition to the Pharisees, of course. But Jesus isn't focused on them today. He's focused on the people. Are you willing, he asks them and us, to place your love for me and and the love above all the love you have for those others who are so precious to you? Do you understand that loving God must be a sacrificial love, that the other loves in your life must never come first? You see, to follow Jesus isn't simply to tag along after him. To follow him is to become a living image of Jesus. Even more than that, it means being whatever Jesus is, wherever Jesus is, serving him by doing whatever he happens to be doing. You see, to do what Jesus does, to bring comfort and healing to the sick, to feed the hungry, to forgive those who have hurt you, to see God's presence in every person you encounter, to love beyond your family and friends, beyond those you are expected to love less your own life and more the lives of others. You see, it's not about me bringing Jesus into my life. It's exactly the opposite. It's about letting Jesus into my life to rule me. St. Paul said it best, I live no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. You know, Jesus calls us to understand what he is asking of us before we commit our lives to him. He wants disciples who know and accept the cost. Disciples who follow full-heartedly. The half-hearted, the lukewarm, need not apply. Embrace the gospel, he calls us. Embrace it without compromise. Be like Mary, who we celebrate today as her birthday. Be like her who followed Jesus and was the perfect disciple. This can be frightening. It demands we set aside our own plans, that we abandon ourselves in trust to the will of God. Yes, it can be frightening, and overcome by fear or by false pride, many turn away from God. And others, motivated by a false humility, do the same, unable to accept the unconditional love of God. You know, once again, Peter provides us with another beautiful example. On the day he first perceived, if only vaguely, the Lord's divinity, he fell before Jesus on his knees in that boat, and he said, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." You see, to love God in his perfection is also to recognize our own imperfections, our own sinfulness. Peter had gone this far, but he hadn't yet tasted God's mercy. Soon enough, though, Peter witnessed God's forgiveness and personally experienced the divine mercy God showers on the repentant. Discipleship is not easy. Indeed, it's so difficult, we can't do it alone. Jesus knows this, and he promises to walk that road with us, just as he walked with the 12 along the hard roads of Galilee on his way to Jerusalem, on his way to the cross and to our salvation. He wants to walk by our side, brothers and sisters. He wants to be your strength. He wants to be my strength. He wants to make the impossible possible. God love you. Usually I forget these. Today, Father reminded me. A few announcements. As you all know, we've been blessed that Hurricane Dorian missed Florida. Unfortunately, the Bahamas have been hit hard, and relief efforts are needed. In an effort to help, there will be a special collection next weekend, September 14th and 15th. The money collected will go to Catholic Charities USA and Catholic Relief Services, and we thank you in advance for your generosity. We have some priest vacations coming up. Father Peter will be on vacation from September 16th to October 10th. Father John will be on vacation from September 28th to October 9th. As a result, the masses are being covered by several visiting priests from the area, so we'll all get to hear some other priests preaching. How's that? Okay. And I now ask Donald and Marjorie to please come forward and join Father and me